The National Rainbow Coalition recently held a conference called 1990 and Beyond. Coming up next, we turn to a panel discussion called Saving the Earth, the Rainbow and the Environment. Participants include Clay Peters of the American Celebration for the Outdoors and Cindy Brinkman of the Council on Economic Priorities.
This session is going to be about the environmental issues and how the Rainbow Coalition is going to handle those. I would like to start out by pointing out that we have with us today the Executive Director of the Blueprint for the Environment Project, which was put together by Clay Peters, who gathered together 30 national environmental groups, and those 30 national environmental groups came up with 750 some specific recommendations for federal action that could be done to make the planet safer. We presented those to President Bush at the outset of his term, and quite frankly, there's not been much leadership, despite the fact that he's labeled himself an environmentalist. As Reverend Jackson says, we must make the distinction. And so I would like to first of all call on Clay Peters to discuss some of the general themes that have run through this major document having to do with the environment, which took a year to complete and involved the time of hundreds and hundreds of people involved in the national environmental movement. Clay Peters.
There are sort of two main parts of the environment in terms of the problems we're dealing with if you stop to think about it and segregate it out a little bit. And I would simply say that those aspects that deal with pollution on one hand and resource degradation on the other. And the further distinction I make on it, if you stop and think of how the environment's been treated from the beginning of time in this country, most of our earlier concerns really dealt with the resource depletion part of it, whether or not we should set aside parks, refuges, and special areas of that type and be careful of a conservation of the resource base itself. It's only been in the last several decades, probably 2 decades mainly, and if you want to stretch a little bit, maybe to 3, that we've really come to grips and recognize this thing that we now call pollution. And that is really overtaking all the concern, it seems, in terms of the resource exploitation part of it, to the point if you look around at what the media coverage has been over the last year or two particularly, it really tends to be more the pollution angles that get most of the attention. I'm not saying that's wrong, but the more traditional things of resources protection and conservation of the resources in the first place have taken a little bit of a back burner position. We are not in a position of leading ourselves to believe, as we tend to do naturally, I think, that we can have infinite growth in a finite space. We've become more and more aware as we've seen the planet from outer space, so we know that there is finiteness to all of our resource base, to the planet itself, and we really need to think more strongly in those terms. It can't go on forever and sustaining the kind of impact that we're having as we've had up to this point in time. Clearly, the availability of money to address some of these things is a major issue. And you can say that about all the issues we confront on the busy agenda that we have across the nation and across the planet. But I think we all have to be hopeful that we'll finally see the day come very soon when some of these problems we face, other than armaments, are really of more serious consequence to our welfare than is armaments itself. And that would clearly seem to be an area we need to give a lot of scrutiny to. I was heightened by the headlines in the Washington Post this morning indicating that maybe we're going to see very soon a strong departure in terms of the expenditures we have here in the United States with regard to that very thing. I want to stress one aspect very strongly with regard to the observations in the blueprint and through the environmental community at large, and that is the tremendous impact of population growth and what that's doing to us around the world and in the United States with regard to the impact on the resource base. Just for a minute, if you'll bear with me, I want to throw a few things out here that are always hard to grasp. But it took us about 1 million years in terms of human beings, or longer, walking the face of this earth to reach a population of 1 billion people on the planet. That happened as recently as 1830. It took 100 years more, which is quite a good span of time, to double that to the year 1930 when we hit 2 billion people. We're getting very close now to a time frame that corresponds with the birth of a number of us in this room. Only 50 years went by when we more than doubled that to 5 billion. That was in 1987, just 2 years ago. And by the year 2000, we're going to hit over 6 billion people. And I suggest that that cannot go on forever because we're having an impact of just numbers of people plus the per capita impact that comes with it that is not sustainable in terms of the quality of life that we all want to achieve. I would just top that off by saying that that represents the kind of figures I'm mentioning and the population we're going to have and the growth of it in this very recent bit of time is a magnitude of 3 times increase for everybody sitting in this room. I don't care when you were born. If you're alive today, if you're just born, or if you are just about on the other end of the spectrum, you will have experienced a 3 times population increase at a minimum during the time of your lifespan. That's pretty phenomenal. We desperately need to be concerned about and look in a holistic way about the carrying capacity of the planet, and that involves the United States ever so importantly as well. The case has been made many times, and it clearly is one of impact as well as just numbers. And when you look at the impact that we as citizens of the United States have on the resource base around the world as well as in our own country, and compared that with a lot of other populations of the world, our per capita impact is phenomenal, and we have to be very conscious of that and realize we need to do something about it. It can't go on forever the way we've been experiencing it.
We do have with us today copies of the Blueprint for the Environment. This is the small book, the overview that was put together. The actual 750-some specific recommendations on the environment that 30 national environmental groups worked on for a year to put together consists of volumes about yay big. And each one of those has within it statutory and regulatory recommendations as to how the United States can take the leadership on these international environmental issues. And so I think that it's something that has great policy implications for us. It's something that great leadership is needed on, and we would hope that this group would be able to look at those matters and endorse those programs and to ask to have that matter taken up at the highest levels. Next, we have with us Sasha Nadapov from the Institute for Policy Studies to deliver some of her concepts as to how we can improve our environmental destiny. Sasha.
I'd like to address a theme that's run through a lot of the conference in these last 2 days. In his speech yesterday, Jesse Jackson spoke of an original impetus behind the rainbow, the coming together of what he called a transcendent agenda. He spoke of this agenda as coming together of the many interests of all the groups who are outside the political mainstream and which coalesced in the rainbow. This idea of a transcendent agenda is an expression of the fact, as well, that we, despite our different labels, housing, education, environment, toxics, the greenhouse effect, recycling, we share fundamental political interests. Next door is a workshop on foreign policy, next door to that on education, on drugs, voter registration. The rainbow is helping us articulate this shared agenda, not only bringing issues together to get strength from one another, but also to get a greater sense of how they're fundamentally related. As an example of this, yesterday's panel on DC statehood did quite an important thing. It took an issue which for many people could be seen as a relatively narrow concern for a very specific group of people, the people in the district, and transformed it into an emblem of democracy. Now DC statehood is clearly the emancipation and the enfranchisement of 700,000 people is necessarily a part of any broad vision of democracy for this country. So the idea of a transcendent agenda doesn't merely assemble a group or set of different issues and people into a political alliance. It actually transforms the issues that come under it and makes them clearly part of a larger vision. In that light, therefore, you can't have, for instance, DC statehood without community reinvestment. You can't have a jobs policy without a drugs policy. And you can't have a Reinvest in America policy without an environmental vision. Environmentalism is moving in the direction of a transcendent agenda. The patchwork of environmental issues that we all work on, clean air, clean water, recycling, toxics, global warming, and even though they originally sprang up individually and are often seen as isolated problems, in fact now are more and more clearly becoming related to each other and to a whole. And not just an environmental whole, I'd like to stress, but a social whole, a democratic whole. In his critique of environmental problems, for example, Barry Commoner argues that environmental destruction is a direct outcome of unequal distribution of wealth, of government irresponsibility, of the lack of democratic mechanisms in our politics, and also corporate unaccountability. There are many examples of the way these interrelations are functioning in environmental battles across the country. For example, the petroleum companies in Louisiana have begun buying up the communities around their different plants in order to escape environmental liability. The toxicity of the petroleum industry, therefore, is not just a problem of pollution. It's not just an environmental problem. An environmental problem has now become a question of community integrity, of public health, and above all, the power of corporations to make decisions for the society and the economy. The fight over the petroleum industry is therefore a fight now of many people, not just environmentalists, but unions, of local governments, and of community activists involved in housing and public health, all of whom have been affected by an environmental problem. Another example. The United Church of Christ issued a report called Toxic Wastes and Race about 2 years ago. The report examined the correlation between the racial makeup of a community on the one hand and the number of toxic sites cited there. And not surprisingly, it found that there is in fact a very clear correlation. The higher the number of toxic sites in a community, the higher the minority percentage of that community is likely to be. 3 out of 5 African Americans and Hispanics live in a community with an uncontrolled toxic waste site in it. In this way, toxic waste, again, is not just an environmental problem. It's about discrimination, it's about the economic power of communities, and again, about the autonomy and the power of industry to make decisions for a community and to destroy a community. Every major environmental problem, therefore, has these deep social and political roots. And as Jan Harkey pointed out yesterday, clean air is predominantly a problem for urban areas. That means it's predominantly a problem for poor and minority groups. And as the cities grow poorer and dirtier, this will become increasingly true. The group of mayors that came in, that won on November 7th, they are going to have to be environmentalists because it is their constituencies who are suffering from these problems the most. So these are the shared interests which make up what I think Reverend Jackson meant when he said a transcendent agenda or a transcendent environmental agenda. At the center of a rainbow vision of the environment, therefore, has to lie these social issues. How can we shut down our poisonous industries and our poisonous factories and still maintain and create jobs for the people who work there? This is a question which probably everyone knows that has been central in the formation of the Green Party in West Germany. Which is one of the most politically successful environmental groups in the world, really. So what we need to do now is to look at the way that the social environmental nexus is showing up around the country in environmental battles for us. We need to look at how the larger social agenda is emerging out of environmental issues, how environmental activists are joining forces with other groups, and how we can advance that progress. So to end, I would like to suggest just a few ways in which we might look at environmental activism advancing larger social questions. Other countries such as Japan and Sweden use environmental regulation and enforcement as a way of stimulating the economy. It encourages research and development in alternative technologies. They use it to create new jobs, industries, and also require industry to invest in new and better capital. So we don't have to accept industry's equation that environmental protection is bad for the economy. Environmental protection is also an economic tool. Or we can look at recycling, which opens up huge windows of opportunities. Since garbage is a local resource and it can be used to provide industries and jobs in local communities, community involvement, the development of new products, as well as reducing hazardous waste, reducing the international waste trade, and getting communities away from incineration. So environmentalism can be seen as the sum of the largest issues of how to run our society. And in this workshop, we'd like people to address their experiences in their areas of work and their areas of the country where the environmental and social nexus has come together. If you would be so kind as to talk about the projects and actions in your areas in which you see forces joining. in which social and environmental progress has been made, then perhaps we can, in the report to the Executive Board of the Rainbow, we can assemble some recommendations of ways in which this progress can move forward. Thank you.